This is a recording of the practice subjunctive passage that begins Cicero Roma in exilium eundi gratia. And I'm recording this outside, so I apologize if there are any sort of other noises, but nevertheless, the recording. Cicero. Here it's modified by the nominative profectus, which is from proficisque or proficisci profectus sum, a perfect passive-looking participle, so we don't say having been, but having, means to set out. So Cicero, having set out, Roma, from Rome. Remember that cities, towns, and small islands do not need prepositions, so if you want to say away from a particular place, it merely is going to appear in the ablative case, which Roma is. And then you have eundi gratia. Eundi is a gerund. It's not modifying anything, and that's how we know it's a gerund, not a gerundive, and it also has one of those gerund forms, and it is the object of the gratia, from the verb eo ire itus, and it would be for the sake of going in exilium, into exile. Our main verb, of which Cicero is the subject, is misit. It is indicative. He did send epistolas plurimas, very many letters, uxori, to his wife. Now, we have our first ut clause. We look at the ut, we see that obsecraret is indeed subjunctive. Otherwise, we would translate the ut as. So, he sent very many letters to his wife, so that, this is a purpose clause, she might beg the Senate, so that she would beg the Senate. Either one could translate that way, because we're in secondary sequence. Beg the Senate, ut, that the Senate immediately recall him. Now, obsecraret is, of course, governed by the first ut, and it is showing a purpose, and the second revocaret is governed by the second ut, and it is showing an indirect command, as it is introduced by that commandy verb obsecraret. Nevertheless, Cicero secum putavit. Cicero thought with himself. Nisi. So immediately we know that, of course, we have a conditional clause on our hand. We see the protasis is introduced by nisi, which means if not or unless. And we also see the quis, which would then, of course, lend us to remember that si, nisi, numen, ne, all the alis fall away. This is really an aliquis, which means somebody or anybody. It's nominative. If somebody evil, and then you have odicet as the verb of the protasis, and you look and you see misus sm. Both of those are, of course, pluperfect subjunctives, telling us that we have a past contrary to fact conditional, which is something that's not true but in the past, and thus we translate, if someone evil had not hated me, then I would have not been sent into exile. That's how you translate the past contrary to fact. Had verbed, would have verbed. Nevertheless, Romam redibo, I will return, I will go back to Rome, redibo being, of course, a future of the verb eo ire, dumodo, provided that my wife prosit. Now, prosit is nothing more than the verb sumesse with pro on the front of it. We've compounded it. And very often, when you compound the verb to be, it will require dative objects, because to be for someone is to support, so it changes somewhat the fundamental meaning. We've seen this happen before with other compounded verbs, like occurro, to meet, which is, of course, the compounding of the verb curro, run, and also the verb apropinquo, which means to approach, compounding of the word propinquo, which means to be near. And so, therefore, provided that my wife supports me. And, of course, it is a proviso clause with prosit as your subjunctive verb. The wife of Cicero, nescivit, perfect tense, did not know quid Cicero egisset, what Cicero had done. Egisset, a pluperfect subjunctive because of an indirect question. Direct question would be, what had he done? Here, of course, in English, we translate it, what he had done. We switch the word order when it becomes an indirect question in English. Latin, they just use a subjunctive verb. Cum lege. So, here we have to find out if we have a subjunctive verb. You scan down the line after cum, since leges obviously is an ablative, and we see two verbs, actually, subjunctive, repelleret, and facti essent. If you ever have two verbs next to each other and they're finite, in other words, they have an ending, you look to see if one of them happens to be subordinated by a word, and thus becoming a different clause, and you do see that repelleret is subordinated by quibus. So therefore, facti essent, which is the pluperfect of the verb theo fieri factus sum. Remember that for the verb facio, you will have a whole nother verb that sometimes looks active, which it does, and especially in the present, imperfect, and future tenses, that is then going to mean to be made, to become, to be done, to happen, to go down, if you would like. And so we do see we have a subjunctive verb. We look into the other clause, to which the cum clause is subordinated, and we do see the tamen as the very first word underneath Cicero. So, although aliquae leges, some laws, aliquae, of course, does mean some or any, although some laws, facti essent, had been made by Clodius, Claudio Quibus, with which he would drive away Cicero from Rome. Cicero tamen, however, fructus est. Now, before we translate the main clause, Cicero fructus est, a word on, of course, facti essent. That is subjunctive, a pluperfect one, because it is the verb of a cum concession, a cum adversative clause. And repelleret is, of course, a subjunctive in a relative clause, but it's a relative clause that shows purpose. It's the purpose of those laws. If we replace the quibus with an ut, it would mean the same thing. It would simply at that point say, so that he could drive away Cicero from Rome. So Cicero, Cicero, however, tamen, fructus est. Now this verb is one of 5 verbs that all are deponent, and they can have either ablative or genitive objects. This is, of course, fruor, frui, fructusum. The others are utor, uti, ususum, fungor, fungi, functusum, which means to perform or carry out, Waskor, wasci, wascutusum, which of course means to eat or devour. Potior, potiri, potitusum, which means to, of course, have power over or control or possess. Here we are going to translate the fructus est as, of course, enjoy, because that's its definition. However, Cicero did enjoy, and thus we see the object is amakidia. Amakidia is friendship. The friendship, hominum quorundam. Hominum is genitive because it's a third declension, homo hominis, and the um is genitive plural. Of, and quorun tells us it's modifying it, since quorun used to be quorum. Whenever an M is before a D, it turns into an N because it makes it slide better off the tongue, and it is the genitive modifying homonym. Of certain men, qui. Qui is taking as its antecedent the homonym, who, posent, were able. That is, of course, from posse, or possum, posse, potui, and you can see it's the infinitive posse plus an nt, so imperfect, who were able to make new laws, novas leges. Now, posent is subjunctive here, an imperfect subjunctive, because we are talking about the kind of men whose friendship Cicero enjoyed. And so, therefore, it is the relative clause showing the characteristic of them, not the specific guys. Just that he knows the kind of guys, or he has the friendship of the kind of guys. Cum senatus concilium proximum habuerit. Now, habuerit in this sentence, I admit I violated sequence of tense. Our main verb is loquebantur, which means that we should be in secondary sequence, and our only options would be imperfect subjunctive or pluperfect subjunctive. I've merely put it in here to emphasize the fact, to get you to be able to see whenever a verb ends with, on a perfect stem, erim, eris, erit, erimis, eritis, erint, it is that perfect subjunctive at times. Told you I was apologizing. I'm outside recording, so hopefully it'll stop in just a minute. I'll pause it until then. Continuing on, I apologize. At any rate, so, we translate it when or since the Senate did hold, or has held, the next council, the next meeting. Concilium is a meeting, and proximum means closest, and thus we would say next. Omnes senatores, all the senators were talking about Cicero. So here I would probably say it's the circumstances, and thus when the Senate held, did hold, has held. Alii. Now, look at the other aliis which follow, so you know to translate it some, and then others, and then others. Some, implied said, let Cicero remain in exile. Maniat is subjunctive, the main verb, and so it is present subjunctive, let the subject verb. And here it's then followed immediately by, of course, a conditional clause with the C, noceret, which is the protasis, and then necesse esset, which is the apodosis. Noceret and esset are both imperfect subjunctives, and so what we have is a present contrary to fact conditional. If he were harming, and that verb, of course, noceret, takes a dative, re publicae, the republic, then it would be necessary. Now, necesse esset is a phrase that is an impersonal phrase. It is necessary. Whenever you have an impersonal phrase or an impersonal verb, your subject is usually going to be an action. That action can either be expressed by a infinitive or by a subjunctive verb with an ut. But the problem is that the ut is usually not even going to be there, and that's exactly what we have here. It should have an ut between esset and n, but it doesn't, and that's what real Latin would be like. It would be necessary that he remain in exile. In English, we wanted to say it would be necessary to remain in exile. But in the Latin, they use and reduce the entire phrase in exilio maniat to being merely a action. And that's why we call it a substantive noun clause. We are taking that entire clause, that entire verbal clause, and reducing it to a noun. Non dubium est. There is no doubt, quin, that oporteat. Now, oporteat is another impersonal verb. Oportet, oportere, oportuit. and it is always going to be translated it is befitting, or if it were past tense, it was befitting. And here it's present tense, and it's present tense subjunctive because it's showing a doubt, the Quin clause of doubt, introduced by the dubium est. So there is no doubt that Quin, it is befitting. Now, again, when you say it is befitting, immediately we would expect in English another infinitive to come out. And that's what you have a lot of times in Latin as well. But we don't. Instead, again, what we see is the subjunctive clause in exilio moretur, moretur from moror, morari, so we, fair giant liar, as functioning as the subject. So the act of he remaining in exile. So you could idiomatically translate it, there is no doubt that it is befitting that he remain in exile. Alii. Others say, why should Cicero remain in exile? So here we have a question being asked, and it is a deliberative, and that's why we translate, of course, it as should he remain in exile. Others, velemus. Now, velemus is, of course, imperfect subjunctive as well. Volo, vele, volui. Vele, V-E-L-L-E, is the infinitive, plus mus. It is the main clause of this sentence, the main verb. And so as an imperfect subjunctive, it will very often show a potential. And it's obviously not going to be an impossible wish. There's no utinam. It's not a deliberative. There's no question. And so it's either going to be the jussive hortatory or the potential. And if it's imperfect, most likely it's going to be the potential. So we would potentially want. You can leave out the word potentially. We might want. We would want. And then here we were expecting a direct object or an infinitive, which would function as the direct object as well. So, of course, the direct object is not there. Instead, what you have is a whole clause, Cicero Romam statum, with the subjunctive verb reveniat. Thus, that entire clause from Cicero down to reveniat becomes the direct object of what we would want. So you could say we would want candy. It would be a dulcem, accusative. Or we would want to study, studere, which you reduce that infinitive down to a noun, which it is, the act of studying. Or here you could say you're reducing the entire subjunctive clause from Cicero maniat, or I'm sorry, Cicero reveniat, as being then the noun, the act of Cicero returning, coming back to Rome immediately. So you can translate it. We would want, we might want, that Cicero come back to Rome immediately. Alii. Others then say, utinam, the impossible wish, with our subjunctive verb fecesset, a pluperfect subjunctive. Would that, or if only Cicero had never numquam made fecesset Clodius very angry. Deinde Milo. Then Milo, amicus Ciceronis, the friend of Cicero, that being an appositive phrase, he facited. Again, you look at revocaret and facit, and you note that revocaret is the verb of the clause quae Ciceronum revocaret, and thus it is the subordinate. So then Milo made a law quae, which would recall, which did recall Cicero. Revocaret is, of course, an imperfect subjunctive, action at the same time or after our main verb of the secondary sequence facit. And here, revocaret is a imperfect subjunctive because it's probably telling you that it is the purpose. It's not going to be the kind of law because it is a specific law that he did make, and so therefore it is saying that he made the law so that he would recall Cicero, but the law which would recall Cicero. Quod. Here, this quote is a linking qui, and it's neuter. So this thing, not as in a law, but this act, because all actions, remember that both infinitives and gerunds are other verbal nouns. The acts themselves are always neuter, and so quote. This thing, this action, you could imply, facit, did make Clodius tam iratum so angry, that as a result. And the is being governed by, of course, the veriti essent, that all the senators had feared, and the veriti essent, which is the verb of a result clause, introduces then ne Clodius down to the faceret, which is then the fear clause, faceret being the imperfect subjunctive of that fear clause. So, this thing, quote, did make Clodius so angry, that, as a result, all the senators had feared pluperfectly, that, and remember that fear clauses, you switch the translations of it to ne, so not that not, but that Clodius, faceret, would make no we ores, new laws. It is a comparative against Milo. See Clodius. Here's the protasis of a new conditional. We look at our verbs of the protasis, faciat, and of the apodosis, mitantur. Both are present subjunctives, and we must have a future less vivid, or the future contrary to fact. should, would are the translations of the verb there. So in the future, potentially, not for fact, but contrary to fact, if Clodius should make other laws, fortasse, then perhaps more senators, plures is comparative, would be sent into exile. All the senators said. Auctoritate nostra utamur. Utamur is one of those 5 verbs that require ablative objects, or sometimes genitive. Utor, uti, usa sum. It means use or enjoy. Here's probably better use, and it is subjunctive, so it's the main verb of a present subjunctive of a main clause, let. Let the subject verb, utamur, let us use our authority, object or ablative, and potiamur, another one of those that, of course, requires an ablative object, potior, potiri, potitisum, and let us control, let us possess, let us have power over Clodia, nay, so that not. It is a negative purpose clause, being, of course, with the verb mittantur, which is subjunctive, so that not anybody else. Si nisi numen ne, all the ali's fall away, and thus the quis is really aliquis, or lest anybody else, and that's why I'm translating alias as else, anybody else, be sent by Clodius into exile. Clodium hortamur. Now, with all the subjunctives, I can probably tell you if you were doing this on your own, you would have translated hortamur subjunctively or think that it is, but it is not. Hortor, hortari, hortata sum, a regular old present subjunctive, or present indicative, I should say, with the correct vowel for a for an indicative. We encourage Clodius. We are encouraging Clodius that. Now, this is then going to be a indirect command, with hortamur being the commanding word, and your verb is reveniendum sit. Now, what you see here is, again, just like in the other passage, a future passive periphrastic happens to be in the subjunctive. That's the helping verb sit, so that we could have it as the verb of the indirect command. And again, it's difficult for us because it is an impersonal. Subject is the nebulous it. And it's passive, but it's an intransitive verb, which is difficult for us. So here you would translate it. We know it's it because the T on sit is he, she, or it, but the UM tells us that the verb subject has to be it, the impersonal. We encourage Clodius that it must be come back, it must be returned, Romam, to Rome, and whenever we have by, it's usually an ablative of personal agent with an a or an ob, but since it is a future passive periphrastic, reveniendum sit, it is going to have your agent expressed in the dative case, kikaroni, instead of the ablative a, kikarone. Now, it must be returned to Rome by Cicero. If you were to compare that really quickly, right in the line above, Clodio in exsilium mittatur, usually with a passive verb, like I said, it would be Clodio, but instead it is now the dative because of the reveniendum sit. Senatus semper pacem quam rixam malet. Now, malet is an interesting verb. It is a combination of the verb volo vele, to want, with, of course, the word magis, which is the comparative adverb of magnopere, which means greatly. You can just translate it as more. So malo, male, maluit, which would conjugate just like volo vele, present tense in the non-subjunctive indicative. It'd be malo, mawis, mawult, just like volo vis wult. But it has the definition of prefer, but inherently within the verb, since magis is there, it will express comparatives, and that's what that quam is doing. So, and of course here it is subjunctive. The subjunctive of volo vele is velim, velis, velit, with, of course, im, is, it, and it's the same for then malo, which is then going to be malim, melis, milit. And here it's either the jussive, let the Senate prefer, or the potential, the Senate would prefer. I think it's the potential here. The Senate potentially implied would prefer always peace. Quam, then, is translated than, but you can put the word rather in there. Rather than a quarrel, a fight, rixam. And the quam is obviously showing the comparison because within the verb malo, male,